Hey class, welcome back. I hope you guys are doing well. We are continuing our lecture here on exploration. This will be the final lecture on exploration before we move on. But today we are going to be focusing in on the actual aspects of the exploration, dealing with the lands that were explored, and especially the impact on the land that was explored. Now this lecture is not very long, but one of the main reasons we have to look at these things was because of the impact that they had on the New World, especially. One of the impacts that take place is the exchange that goes on between lands. So you have not just trade, thinking of Europeans coming to the New World, getting something and taking it back to Europe. But the Europeans didn't just come to the New World and grab some stuff and go back. They stayed, and especially when you start thinking of some of the settlements that take place and some of the invading into the inner areas of the New World, they brought things with them that were very dangerous and deadly to the indigenous populations of the New World. For example, when you bring in smallpox, Europe had an immunity to smallpox. Yes, people died in Europe from smallpox, but they were exposed to smallpox and were able to. Their immune system was able to fight that off, and they were able to survive a smallpox attack. But when they bring smallpox into an indigenous population that had never experienced smallpox, it was just deadly. It completely devastated them. As I'm going to talk about coming up here in the PowerPoint, the Aztecs and the Incas, even though the Spanish came in and they did fight them militarily and killed some of them militarily in battles, the Aztecs and the Incas were decimated by smallpox. The Spanish didn't have to really fight any wars with them. They did fight some wars, but they didn't have to fight any wars with them because the smallpox that they brought just completely decimated those populations. And that's just an example of the exchange that takes place that is not good for the indigenous population. So even though we look at the age of exploration as this great age, and getting out there and exploring and finding new lands, and how the Europeans were spreading out and coming out of the Renaissance, and just really looking at what's going on in the world, and finding the world is round, and getting to new lands, and the discovery, and great names like that we talk about, like Magellan and Christopher Columbus, and all these different things that go on. We got to remember that there was impacts that happen on the land and on the people. Also, you have these indigenous populations that had their own religions. They had their pagan religions. They worshipped their deities and all of that. But now you have the Europeans coming in and forcing, basically, they forced the Catholic religion on the indigenous population. So you see these impacts that come in. So we're going to be looking at that here just in a minute. So stay tuned. All right, students, we're going to now move into World History 2 Exploration Part 2. This is our final lecture on the explorers. As I said from last time, we looked at some explorers themselves, the actual men that did the exploration, but today we're going to move now into more details of exploration, some of the lands, some of the details that take place. But the first slide here I just wanted to share with you, there's a couple of geographical areas that you need to know on the maps. And these are the capes and straits and some of the passages. And you'll see in your textbook on page 490, there's a map of these different land areas. So the first one is the Cape of Good Hope. This is the southern tip of the African continent, down there by South Africa. And this is where like Da Gama and others, they went around the Cape of Good Hope. We also see Cape Horn, which is the southern tip of South American continent, and the actual the entire peninsula there sticking out is called the southern part of it is called the Cape of Good, the Cape Horn. But in Cape Horn, there's the Strait of Magellan. And I mentioned that last time. But the Strait of Magellan is a small natural waterway at the tip of modern-day Chile that allows ships to skip going around the actual Cape Horn. It's a little narrow passageway that you can slip through. And they definitely took advantages of that because that strait is calmer waters, and it also cuts off some distance. And then the Northwest Passage is the waterway that connects the Pacific Ocean and the Arctic Ocean. This is between present-day Alaska and Russia. It's also known as the Bering Strait. Okay, some other aspects of exploration. Okay, so we have the Treaty of Tordesillas. Treaty of Tordesillas, signed on June 7th, 1494. It was an agreement between Spain and Portugal to divide the newly discovered American continents. Okay, so basically, when it was signed, it was basically Latin America because it was only 2 years after Columbus landed. So we're talking about that portion of the Caribbean area. So don't think yet all North America and all of that. But it was a dividing line for Spain and Portugal. Now, the thing is that they had not explored extensively yet the amount of land that there was. And you'll see in a map coming up that Spain definitely gets the good end of the deal, and Portugal does not. So at first, Portugal, that's spelled wrong. Portugal was not very involved in their settlement that they had founded. However, when the French and the Dutch showed interest in Brazil, that's basically where Portugal was interested, Portugal did colonize Brazil. And even to this day, the Brazilians, if you go to Brazil today, they do not speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese. But Spain is the one that came out on top with this treaty. They became a major power because of the vast land area west of this dividing line, which was their designated area. In all fairness, it was Spain's designated area. It's just that it was just a massive amount of area. So right here, you can see the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is the solid purple line. Okay? And this area here is what was basically given to Portugal. And this area here was given to Spain. So just a massive amount of area. That's why when you start dealing with exploration, with dealing with the Aztecs and the Incas, so you have the Aztecs up here, the Incas up here, the Spanish are the ones that came in and evangelized them and had contact with them and also decimated them with their disease. But this area here went to Spain, and this little area went to Portugal. Okay, moving on. We are now going to look at the English East India Trading Company in 1600. And it wasn't long after the explorers founded the shipping lanes to India that some companies were set up to help with trade, speed up trade, make sure that there was no interference with trade. So the English East India Company, Trading Company, 1600, was a group of London merchants who were granted a charter by Queen Elizabeth I to trade in the East Indies. Basically what they would do is they would export English goods of wool and metal to India, and then from India they would bring in the spices and the riches from India. So trading agents were set up in stations, their coastal settlements, along kind of the route to negotiate trade for the next incoming shipment from England. So these agents knew that wool and metals were coming from England, and when they arrived, they would offload and trade and put on the ships spices, the returning ships, spices, and they would then return to England. And so these agents would set up the trade and try to get the best trade value that they could. This organized trade allowed for a substantial increase in trade and wealth. It was a lot faster. And people in England that were involved in this trading became very wealthy. Very wealthy. You had ship merchants, you had ship owners that became very wealthy, merchants that became very wealthy, the people that were selling it in England became very wealthy. So this just really was substantial for them. It helped the British government establish control over India, and they would have control over India for centuries. India gained its independence in 1948 after the Second World War. So for well over 3 centuries, the British owned India. And they had a rival, was the Dutch East India Company that was set up in 1602. So the Dutch got involved in there. Now the Dutch wouldn't last. The British would be the ones that remained in control. Okay, another aspect of exploration was called the Columbian Exchange. And what the Columbian Exchange is, it was a name given to the global diffusion of plants, food, animals, humans, and disease that impacted the lands that were explored, and they had never experienced these things before. And so there was a great impact on the lands, on their environment, on the people, the indigenous people. So this diffusion, which means kind of like trade back and forth, or like introduction of new things like plants or foods, animals into these areas that are being explored, it caused an impact on them. So, for example, plants, food, and crops. The introduction of maize and potatoes, beans, peanuts, rice into Europe. Introduced of horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens into the New World, so animals. Just dealing with people. Europeans settled in the New World. I mean, if you just think about what takes place, take, for example, the North America. So exploration begins in North America, and they meet the Native Americans in North America. They didn't leave the Native Americans alone. Okay, they began to create settlements in Jamestown, settlements in New England, in Boston, or the Massachusetts area. You think of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock. You think about these Europeans now coming into the New World. They moved in and they settled there, and they just continue to creep in and merge in and move in, impacting the land, impacting the Native Americans. They began to make settlements, make cities. They traded and bartered. I mean, again, the island of Manhattan in New York, the island of Manhattan was traded for a box of junk, a box of trinkets that the Indians had never seen, the Native Americans had never seen. They just thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, and they went and traded the entire island of Manhattan for a box of trinkets. So the impact of Europeans coming into the New World, this is part of the Columbian Exchange. The next one that I want to talk about is disease, and this is big. You need to know this. You need to understand this. This will be on the exam. You had Europeans coming into these populations that had never experienced these diseases before. So the Europeans had immunity to them. They had an immune system that was strengthened against these diseases that were in Europe. Well, they bring these diseases into a people group that had never experienced the smallpox or measles, and these diseases killed and just wiped out these indigenous populations. So we see there for diseases: smallpox, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, and influenza. were introduced to indigenous peoples by the Europeans. And for example, smallpox basically destroyed the Aztecs and the Incas. It just wiped them out. And then another example is Mexico's population was decimated. Like 90%, I believe, of Mexico's population was killed by disease that was brought in. So I mean, we're talking just horrific consequences by this exploration called the Columbian Exchange, this exchange of things. And here we have an exchange of disease coming from Europe into the New World and just destroying the indigenous population. And that's it for exploration part 2. Again, I mean, we could just spend lecture after lecture after lecture on what these explorers did and all of that, but we just got to hit the main ones and just move on then. So continue to keep up on your reading, but I just wanted to share that we are going to be moving into switching gears. We're going to be moving into the next good number of lectures. I'm not sure how many are on the syllabus, 4 or 5 lectures on the Reformation. A very important time period. So switching gears. So we've talked about the Renaissance, we've talked about exploration, and now we're going to move into the Reformation. All of this is within the Renaissance period, but just different aspects. And the Reformation, we can't skip over it, and we got to spend some time on it because it is so important to who we are as Christians, as Protestants, and then obviously getting all the way down into being evangelicals or even Baptists. So it's a very important time period that we will be covering a little bit in depth, especially with some of the people, Martin Luther, John Calvin. We'll be talking about them. So hang in there with what you're doing. Start to think about maybe what you're wanting to look at in regards to a research paper topic, and thinking about now you're starting to get in some names that you might remember or kind of find interest in, and then you want to get into researching that person. It doesn't have to be this early. I mean, again, you only have one research paper on a person, so if you want to do something from World War II, that's great. Research them, or an event such as a later on event. Maybe even an event such as the assassination of John F. Kennedy or something. I don't know. That's within our time period. So if you want to research that, but just start thinking about that because it's going to come up fast, especially if you have other classes going on online. Those professors are going to want their things done and have an emphasis on their topics and papers. So just start thinking about these things. Balance your time out. Schedule your time out. So. Go ahead and begin thinking of that. Other than that, that's all I have for you. I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.